the changing political situations with which Jyoti alluded to also had a huge effect on Zheng Zhilong's life. But Zheng Zhilong was a very different person from al-Nehrawali. Not only was he Chinese, but he was also anything but a scholar. In fact, when we're going to zoom into his early life and one of the stories about him. But I want to situate us. So if you look at this map, we are moving now from the Western Indian Ocean way over here, and you see the Ottoman Empire stuff. We're also moving forward in time, right? So we're no longer in the 16th century. We're now at the beginning of the 17th century. So Zheng Zhilong was probably born maybe a decade after the death of al-Nehrawali, but he was, we don't know exactly because we don't have great sources on his early life. But anyway, we are going to move over from the Western Indian Ocean and the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire to the Ming Dynasty over here, which was one of the largest, most populous, and most powerful and wealthiest countries in the world. It started in 1368. I mean, most of you are probably pretty aware of the Ming Dynasty, but yeah, from 1368, we know that by the early 1600s, the Ming Dynasty was entering sort of a new phase. Some people talk about its decline as having been very set in stone at this point. I think it's probably, we can differ on that a bit, but this is a late empire. This is an empire that is no longer in its heyday. And we're going to zoom in on one particular place. Is my app good? This is a place that maybe many of you wouldn't have heard of very much, which is a maritime city known as Quanzhou. Quanzhou is a very famous maritime center. And in fact, the Islamic networks that went across the Indian Ocean in the earlier period, before the Ming Dynasty, reached their terminus in Zhengzhou. And so there was a very large sort of Muslim community there of traders, multi-ethnic traders, basically. Chinese, Gujarati people were there, many people from all over the Indian Ocean and beyond traded there. So it was a very important city. But we're going to, I told you I would tell you a story. So let's go to the story. We're going to zoom in on, this is Quanzhou here, and somewhere in this region was the prefectural yamen, or prefectural offices, which might have looked like this. We don't have a good image of the one in Quanzhou, but it would have looked like this. This was a large, sort of, almost like a palace complex that was the center of administration for the prefecture. And a prefecture in the Chinese system is a very large unit. So above a county, below a province, but very populous. Many states in Europe at this time were smaller and less populous than prefectures. And Zheng Zhilong was, we're talking, this is probably in the very early part of the 1600s, maybe 1615 or so. He was, now if you think about the usual route to wealth and success and influence in China, the way to do it is, if you're a boy, is to study. And so parents, of course, wanted all of their kids to study, or all of their boys to study, so that they could pass the examinations. And the Chinese examination system was, from the perspective of Europeans, at this period and into the early 1700s, a sort of marvel of meritocracy, where a philosopher elite could be found from among the people, because any person, well, there were certain criteria. You had to be a man, of course. You also had to, like, basically most social classes could engage, but there were a couple ones that couldn't. But basically, it was quite meritocratic, especially compared to Europe at the time. Anyone could take the exam, and if you passed the local exam, you go on to the prefectural exam and the provincial exam, etc. If you passed each level, you were promised and often achieved great influence and wealth and power, because the officials were chosen from this. And the Chinese state was a very significant and large and effective structure. So this was the usual path, scholarship. But Zheng Zhilong was not a scholar. He did not like to study. And so instead of studying as he should be, memorizing Mencius and learning Confucius, learning to write the calligraphy and the rhymed prose, he basically ran around the streets with his brothers. And one day, so the story goes, he was running after this. Has anyone had lychees, fresh lychees? They are so good. Yeah. The fresh lychee, which they usually become ripe in like May or so, July, June. They're so delicious. And so there were some of these lychees hanging over the wall of the prefecture. And Zheng Zhilong and his brothers started throwing rocks at them. And one of the rocks sailed over the walls and hit the prefect in the head. So this is like hitting the governor in the head, right? Not a good thing. And the governor, of course, was mad who was throwing these rocks. He sent his men after to look for the boys. And Zheng Zhilong was hauled before the prefect. And the prefect took one look at him and liked what he saw and said, this is the face of one destined for wealth and nobility, and let him go. Okay, so like many, you look skeptical. Like many of these stories from Chinese history, we do have to be skeptical. But like these stories that are preserved, they also sort of they encapsulate a character or say some kind of moral. And in this case, it seems to encapsulate kind of Zhilong's luck and his way. He tries to grab for things that are not his, and instead of getting in trouble, he actually is let go, or as we'll see, actually does even better. So he was kind of a rapscallion running around the streets. He got in some kind of trouble, and we don't know exactly what it was. His father got very mad at him. It could be that he, as one source says, ran his hand up the skirt of a concubine of his father's. But we don't know exactly what happened. Another source says that his father chased him through the streets with a stick, and that Zhilong jumped on a ship. So this is the first sort of major juncture in his life, the jumping on a ship. And I want to use this sort of opportunity to tell us a little bit about this area of the world that many of us don't think very much about. And that is the China Seas, or the Western Pacific, as Shane put it. This is an area that I think often when we think about traditional China, imperial China in the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty, we think of it as sort of closed and insular place. And we often talk about the Zheng voyages, right, in the early Ming period. That's something that is in many textbooks and everything. And so in the early 1400s, the Ming Dynasty recently established sends out these vast fleets. And by the way, Zheng, the Zheng character is the same character as Zheng Zhilong, but they weren't related. But it's the same character. But we think about after these voyages were abrogated in the 1430s, that basically then the Ming Dynasty turns inward and China becomes very insular. And that's often seen, some people have described it as the biggest mistake that the Ming Dynasty ever made, one of the greatest mistakes in Chinese history, because of course the Portuguese were going out just at that time, right? But in fact, through the Ming Dynasty and certainly into the early 1600s, China was not closed off. So, and one reason that we know that is that there's lots of sources that tell us that, not just Chinese sources, but also Japanese sources, Southeast Asian sources, European sources. And one of the cool ones is this map. This is known as the Selden map of China after the British man who bought it in the early 1600s. And if you look at it, well, just tell me what you see when you look at this map. The typical map of China shows just China with water around it, water sort of a boundary, right? And then there's mountains on the other side. But what do you see when you look at this map? This is the Chinese map produced in the early 1600s.
Philippines.
What's that?
Philippines.
Yeah, you see the Philippines over here, right? And this is Vietnam area, right? This is the Malaysian Peninsula. This is Sumatra, Java, etc. So we see, like, instead of China being kind of isolated, what we see is a China that's actually integrated. It's not at the center of the story, but it's a very prominent part of the story. But another thing that you can't really see on this, because this map is vast, it's really, really large, and there's all sorts of tiny little characters, tiny to us, that discuss all the places. So if you kind of jot down some of those places, basically you see this, and what it is it's you can see it as sort of an X-ray of Chinese trade in this period. The Chinese traders, especially people from the Quanzhou area, and Yegang is the port for Quanzhou, one of the ports for Quanzhou, they carried more in volume and value than any other group in East or Southeast Asia, probably more than Europeans, more than the Portuguese, more than the Spanish, more than the Dutch when they arrived, more than the English when they arrived. And that was true through the end of the period that Alan was talking about, right? And this is another question when we talk about periodization. One of the things about this early modern period is when does European power become sort of overwhelming? And when you look at the trade routes and trade dominance, I guess you could say, as an index of that, the Chinese continue to compete very effectively against Europeans throughout this period and into the early 1800s and maybe beyond. We're still trying to piece this together. But in any case, this is the world that Zheng Zhilong, when he was jumping on a ship, there were many ships to choose from that could go, that went all these different places. His uncle, his mother's brother, was based in this place, Macau. And Macau was a Portuguese colony or a settlement, really. It wasn't wrested from the Ming Dynasty by force. It was kind of agreed upon as a little place that they could settle. And whenever the Portuguese threatened to misbehave, the Chinese could sort of close off the port, and basically they kept them under control. But Macau, this is from the early 19th century. So at the time period we're talking about here is 1610, 1618 or so, somewhere around then. It would have looked quite similar. And you might have seen here, you could hear, just imagine hearing the bells full from the cathedrals, incense wafting out, people selling things, maybe lychees. And Zheng Zhilong, as he maybe saw Japanese stone carvers carving on this church, which is now ruined, but in those days it's being built. And this is the Virgin Mary. The Chinese says the Heavenly Mother stomps on the dragon's head. Whatever the case, Zheng Zhilong found something he liked in Catholicism, and he converted. And he learned Chinese and took on a Christian named Nicholas Gaspard. And this was another very important juncture. So not only did he leave home, but he also began to learn a language, learn Portuguese. And that opened up, just as Alnela Wali's linguistic expertise opened up all sorts of avenues, it set the rest of his life. If he had not learned Portuguese, the rest of his life wouldn't have happened the way it did. So let's look at that. The first place he went after leaving Macau was Hirado. Actually, he may have gone to the Philippines for a little bit. We don't know for sure. But Hirado is in Japan. I'm going to skip back. So basically, it's here around Nagasaki. And Hirado was another major bustling port. Again, we have to think about Japan as a closed country. And indeed, it was after 1639 to a certain extent. But in these days, Japan was very much integrated in this bustling East Asian maritime world and Southeast Asian maritime world. So he went here and he met two people. The first of which was this woman here. She probably didn't look like this. We have no idea what she actually looked like. But this was Tagawa Matsu, who became his wife, Zheng Zhilong's wife, and became pregnant with this boy, Zheng Chenggong, who became far more famous than his father. I won't have a chance to talk about him very much because there's too much to talk about with the pirate father. But in any case, he met her, and he also met a man named Li Dan. Li Dan was a trader because there was an enormous amount of money to be made trading between Japan and China. This trade was illegal because the Japanese, illegal from the perspective of China, because the Ming Dynasty had suffered under what they called Japanese pirates, who really weren't Japanese. There were all sorts of pirates, but Japanese were among them. But the point is that China was eager for silver. Silver prices in China were higher than anywhere else in the world. And some scholars have argued, in fact, that the Spanish Empire wouldn't have happened the way it had happened if it hadn't been for China's thirst for silver, because it wouldn't have made sense to open the big silver mines in the Inca areas, formerly Inca areas, etc. But in any case, there was lots of money to be made. The Japanese were also producing large amounts of silver. And Li Dan was one of the main traders in silver. And so he soon left. And so Zheng Zhilong left with him, and they went here to the Henghu Islands, windswept islands in the Taiwan Strait. So Quanzhou is somewhere over here. This is Taiwan. This is from a Dutch map. And this is the Penghu Islands. And the Dutch, we're meeting another major player now, and that is the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company is often overshadowed in America and in the Anglophone world by the English East India Company. But in the 17th century and into the early 18th century, it was far more powerful, more wealthy, and more influential than the English East India Company. It was, people have described it as the world's first modern corporation because it had a permanent capital and stock and all that. People have also made calculations and figured that it is the largest company in the world, even up to now, in terms of market cap. Now, if obviously, I think I'm going to get some more skeptical looks because, of course, when we make calculations like this, how do you compare it to Google and Amazon? So, but some economists have looked at that, and indeed, the Dutch East India Company seems to come out as one of the largest and most wealthiest companies in terms of market capitalization ever. But in any case, it's a very important company, and it was just arriving in East Asia when Zheng was beginning to sail around. That is the early 1620s now. And the Dutch had set up a little fortress right here in the Penghu Islands, and they wanted to trade in China. They needed a base. They wanted Macau, but the Portuguese wouldn't give it to them, and they couldn't capture it from the Portuguese because the Portuguese and the Chinese kept them out. And so they wanted to set up a base here. But the Ming Dynasty did not want them to, sent an army, and needed someone to translate. And that's where Zheng came in, because he knew Portuguese, and the Dutch could communicate with him in Portuguese. It was sort of a lingua franca. So Zheng began to translate and basically helped persuade the Dutch to leave the Penghu Islands and go to a wasteland. This is, by the way, the Dutch will skip that. The wasteland was Taiwan. In those days, I mean, I did call it a wasteland. I know I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek with that, but there was no large-scale settlement on Taiwan of Chinese or Japanese. It was inhabited by agricultural peoples, Austronesian Aborigines, sort of related to the Malaysian people, Malayo-Polynesian peoples. But there was no sort of massive agriculture. So the Ming Dynasty didn't consider it a major center, and it was fine for them if the Dutch went there. So the Dutch set up a little fortress down there and began to build a colony, which became one of the Dutch East India Company's most prosperous colonies, with big sugar plantations and rice fields, etc. But Zheng stayed on with the Dutch as a translator. He continued with them, and then became a privateer. And this is where he takes another important step. He began to pillage for money. Now, the Dutch East India Company can be considered the greatest first modern corporation, but you can also consider it a huge pirate company, right? Because it made a lot of its money, especially in the early days, by capturing Spanish and Portuguese ships, and also capturing Chinese ships of people who traded with their enemies, with the Dutch enemies. And that's where Zheng came in. So under the Dutch flag, the orange, white, and blue, he began to capture Chinese ships, and the Dutch got a lot of money from it. I have some statistics about how much money that was. One time, the Dutch East India Company governor of Taiwan wrote that Zheng ship was leaking and sailed into Taiwan, into their harbor, past the big guns and the walls, and then we received for our half of his takings, as we had contracted with him, about 960 pieces of 8, so Spanish silver, which is about 150,000 US dollars today. And another time, the take was many times that, probably on the order of $5 million. So these were large hauls, and he indeed became very quickly a huge pirate. And when I say huge pirate, I don't mean that he was physically large, right? We don't know. But he had probably 20 to 30,000 people under him. So when we think about piracy in this period, and this is the period of the Caribbean pirates, right? Pirates of the Caribbean, those bands of pirates were probably on the order of several thousand, maybe 5,000. He had, it basically is an order of magnitude difference. And the people in China, the Ming Dynasty officials, began to get nervous. And here is a quote that one of them wrote. the Governor General of Guangdong and Guangxi provinces, the two southern provinces, wrote that this pirate Zheng is extraordinarily cunning, practiced in the art of sea warfare. His followers are more than 30,000 in total. His cannons are made by foreign barbarians, and his warships are huge and tall and meticulously made. They never sink when they enter the water, etc. His cannons are so accurate and powerful that they can strike at a distance and immediately annihilate anything. So not only did he gain by his mastery of Portuguese this position as a mediator, but that position also gave him access to new kinds of weapons that were being developed in the wars that were seizing Europe at this period, right? Wars between Holland, Spain, etc. This was a period of great military innovation in Europe. And that military innovation was very quickly adopted by people like Zheng, and then also in mainland China, very quickly. But you can see again, this connection with the Dutch, brought by his intermediary status, gave him enormous advantages. The Ming dynasty was having trouble. Oh, this is a cool, basically just an image to give you a sense. When we talk about the maritime world in this period, we often talk about different ethnicities and peoples, right? But really, this was a very hybrid world. And what's I think most interesting about it, this period, not just in East Asia, but really throughout the Indian Ocean world as well, is how multi-ethnic and how combined everything was. So this ship, if you see, is a traditional Chinese junk. It's flying the Dutch East India Company flag, but it has European elements with the rigging here, the bowsprit and these topsails, with some rigging that's European, and then these traditional rattan sails, right? So this just gives you a sense of how kind of mixed up this world was and how people were adopting all sorts of things. On this ship, you would have had people speaking different languages, Chinese, Japanese, Dutch, Malay, all sorts of people would have been on the ship. And so Zheng Zhilong, by being a mediator, was sort of in a privileged position to bring the best of all these different worlds and adapt them. But what would China do about this very powerful pirate? Well, the Ming were at war, and this kind of gets to the point that Zheji raised of political changes. That opened up new possibilities for Zhilong, because here, this is the Manchus were here. They weren't called the Manchus yet, but they would call themselves the Manchus. They built a very effective state, and they began to attack in the 1620s farther and penetrate into Ming Dynasty territory here in the yellow. So this is, if you need orientation, this is China over here, Beijing is over here, and this is the Manchu homeland, Korea is over here. So they were very preoccupied, the Ming officials, and they didn't feel that they had a way of directly stopping Zheng Zhilong themselves, so they decided to co-opt him. They offered him the position of admiral. So this reminds me of the first story, right? Here he is, he's going to war, but instead of being actually punished for it, he's actually almost rewarded. And there are some stories that say that the person who began to co-opt him, began to recruit him, was the same guy he hit in the head. We don't know if that's true. But there's a little bit of evidence about that. In any case, they said, if you will rid the seas of pirates and give us some security on our maritime areas, you can be the roving admiral and you can have trade, you can have some influence over trade. And so he did it. But of course, it's very hard to control pirates. So as soon as he said, no, we can't go pillage anymore, of course, the pirates took off, and they began to threaten him. One of them, a guy named Hui Qi, basically invaded his territory, and then Zheng Zhilong needed help. So what did he try to help? Just didn't cover his old buddies. And they said, sure. And so this is a fascinating image, actually. And we've recently, some scholars particularly in Holland, based on some of my work, have figured out that this is actually, it's not a battle. It used to be thought that this is a battle between Dutch and East Asian forces, between Chinese and Dutch forces. In fact, it's a combined battle of some Chinese forces on the one hand against the Dutch East India Company and other Chinese forces on the other. So again, you get this sense of this mixed up world that's very, very interesting. The Dutch East India Company helped Zheng Zhilong, and so he stayed on top. And then the Dutch East India Company got very mad at him because he couldn't keep his promises to let them trade in China. It wasn't his fault, but they didn't know that. So they attacked him, and then he attacked them back. Actually, it was a sneak attack, and got very, very angry at them and wrote a letter saying, "You've behaved like a pirate." I mean, yeah, how that's behaved like a pirate, right? In any case, he eventually issued a challenge to them, and this is just, there's so many details that are so fun, and I won't go into many of them, but I think he basically wrote to the Dutch, insulted them, and challenged them to a public fight, which the Dutch governor said, fine, yeah, you want to take us on, our ships are bigger than yours, we destroyed your best ships already in the sneak attack, so yeah, we'll fight you out in the open. But Zheng Zhilong was basically used deception. It's always very canny. So maybe this is another moral for those of us who are thinking about making our way in the world. If you're going to war, be sneaky as hell. And he did this a number of times, not just in this, but basically he disguised his ships as they looked like really big, powerful ships that the Dutch would just meet head on, but actually they were floating bombs filled with gunpowder and stuff like that, and filled with men and cannons too, to really complete the illusion. But the Dutch were completely taken unawares, and Zheng Zhilong defeated them and sent them back to Taiwan. But he didn't carry on the war. He made peace with them, and then both sides began to make money. The amount of money they made was enormous. Based on Chinese sources, it seems to be the case that Zheng Zhilong's family, based in Xiamen near Zhengzhou, was bringing in more money on the China trade than the yearly income that Zheng Zhilong was bringing in was greater than that of the entire Dutch East India Company, this most powerful company in the world, right, with market cap like Google, right, roughly. That gives us another sense of like how little we know about this area and how important, how much was going on that we kind of missed when we focused just on Europe, right? So Zheng Zhilong was helped by these political changes, right, by the Ming Dynasty fighting, but then the Ming Dynasty fell. It didn't fall altogether, though. What happened is that the Manchus captured Beijing, they set up their emperor, they called themselves the Qing Dynasty now, and they began to press southward onto Zhilong's areas. And Zheng Zhilong at first fought on behalf of the Ming because there were a number of Ming princes that set themselves up and he wanted to support them. But at a certain point, he saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to switch over. And so he did. In 1646, he went to negotiate with the Qing, intending to take their offer. But his son said, no, Dad, don't do that. That's stupid. This is his son, Zheng Zheng. That was the little boy that you saw in the statue. He's now grown up. He's gone back to China. He's a scholar, unlike his father, but also very loyal to him. And so he told his father not to go over. His father did anyway. Zheng Zheng, the son, began to gather together the father's armies and took over basically. And the Qing then decided to capture Zheng Zhilong. Zheng Zhilong had a corps of African musketeers that were very powerful, very effective. Again, you get the sense of how mixed up this world was, that African musketeers were so significant, and they protected him for a while, but the Qing eventually took him, and that was the downfall of Zheng Zhilong. I won't talk about the son. The son became very famous. There's a huge statue of him in Xiamen City, and basically the son kept fighting on behalf of the Ming, but eventually lost and then invaded Taiwan and captured Taiwan. These are some images from it. And that's how the Dutch East India Company lost one of its most powerful colonies, one of its wealthiest colonies, from this connection that it had from this family for so long that turned in a different way. So conclusions, very quickly. What can we learn from Zheng Zhilong? One, learn languages. Learn languages, especially when the world is changing. Two, the world often changes in major ways that we can't foresee. And what side we're going to end up on is really hard to tell. And I think that war is something often historians don't talk about war, global historians, social historians. war is so important. I think that when we talk about the fortunes of individuals, war affects the fortunes of millions, and it's one of the most significant things that happens in history. But how do we study it? How do we study war in a global perspective? That's an interesting question. Another maybe lesson is when you have an enemy, sneakiness works, but make sure your family is behind you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.